The warriors' capture. The cold steel walls of the alien fortress hummed with an eerie silence. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. The War Council of the Celleri, a brutal alien race known for their ruthless conquests, had finally captured their most elusive and dangerous target, a lone warrior from Earth. Not just any warrior, but Bantu, a man whose legend had spread across the stars. The aliens had fought and conquered many species, but this human had proven to be more than just a soldier. He had been a ghost in battle, a force they could not contain. Until now. Bantu sat in the center of a reinforced energy cage, his body still, his expression unreadable. Chains of alien technology wrapped around his arms and legs, glowing with an unnatural blue light, designed to suppress even the strongest of creatures. The Celleri believed they had won. Their leader, Commander Folktale, stood before him, grinning in triumph. "You fought well, human," Folktale sneered, pacing back and forth like a predator savoring its victory. "But even legends fall. Even ghosts can be caught." Bantu did not respond. He simply lifted his eyes, calm and unshaken. There was no fear, no struggle, only silence. It unsettled the soldiers around him. They had expected rage, defiance, maybe even begging. But there was none. Only the slow, rhythmic breathing of a man who seemed completely unbothered by his capture. Outside the chamber, the fortress pulsed with activity. Celleri soldiers moved in formation, monitoring their defenses, making sure no Earth forces would attempt a rescue. The fortress itself was an impenetrable structure, built from an unknown metal that had withstood asteroid impacts and planetary bombardments. Escape was impossible. At least, that's what the Celleri believed. Then the first soldier disappeared. It happened so quickly, so silently, that no one noticed at first. A guard standing near the entrance of the interrogation room was there one moment, and gone the next. His weapon clattered to the floor. His communicator blinked uselessly. His presence was erased from reality in the span of a breath. The security cameras flickered, static washing over the screens before returning to normal. The Celleri soldiers didn't react immediately, too distracted by their victory. Then another vanished. This time, a soldier standing near Folktale turned his head, blinking in confusion. "Dren? Where did?" His words died in his throat as he noticed the empty space where his fellow warrior had stood. There was no sound, no scream, no struggle. The air itself seemed to devour them. A cold shiver ran through the room. The celebration faltered. Whispers of unease spread like wildfire. Folktale narrowed his eyes, his fingers tightening around his plasma blade. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Bantu slowly looked up for the first time, his dark eyes locked onto Folktale's, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You should not have taken me," he said, his voice steady, deep, and filled with something ancient. The lights flickered. The fortress groaned as if something massive and unseen had shifted within its walls. The air grew heavier, pressing down on the aliens like an invisible force. Then, another soldier was gone. Panic broke out. The Celleri scrambled for their weapons, shouting orders into their communicators, but the signals were met with static. Alarms blared, red lights flashing wildly, but they only added to the confusion. In the chaos, Bantu remained motionless, his expression unreadable. He did not move, yet the world around him was unraveling. The Celleri had captured him, thinking they had taken a simple warrior. They did not realize that they had stolen something far more powerful than a man. And now, the fortress was paying the price. The warrior's secret. The fortress was no longer a place of victory. The air, once filled with the arrogance of conquest, now carried an invisible weight, an unnatural presence that the Celleri could not explain. Soldiers moved hurriedly through the halls, their weapons drawn, their bodies tense. The disappearances were spreading, and no one had an answer. Inside the interrogation chamber, Commander Folktale clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching over his plasma blade as he stared at the prisoner before him. Bantu had not moved an inch since the chaos began. He sat, arms bound, gaze calm. There was no fear in his expression, no desperation. It was as if he already knew what was coming. Folktale stepped closer, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "What is this?" he growled. "Some kind of human trick." Bantu did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes reflecting the dim, flickering light overhead. "You have made a mistake," he said finally, his voice steady, unwavering. Folktale scoffed. "The only mistake was letting your kind believe you could stand against us. Your armies have fallen. Your world is ours." Bantu's lips twitched, something between a smirk and a grimace. "You think this is about war?" His voice was almost amused, yet there was something deeper beneath his tone, something ancient. Another soldier disappeared. This time, the entire room noticed. The XLRE warriors flinched as the spot where their comrade once stood was now empty, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. No sound, no struggle, no trace. Folktale whipped around, his rage now laced with something he would never admit. Fear. Where did he go? He snapped, but no one had an answer. The guards backed away from the interrogation cell, as if distance from the prisoner would keep them safe. Bantu exhaled, tilting his head slightly as if listening to something unseen. His shoulders remained relaxed despite the rising panic around him. "You should not have taken me," he repeated, voice softer this time, but more powerful than before. The walls of the fortress groaned, a deep, unsettling sound like the belly of a great beast shifting in its sleep. The floor trembled, the lights dimming for a second before flaring too bright, casting sharp shadows that moved when no one did. The XLRE soldiers were trained for battle, for slaughter. They had faced beasts that towered over cities, fought wars that burned entire moons, yet none of that had prepared them for this. The enemy they faced now was not one they could see. One soldier, younger than the rest, stepped forward, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. His voice wavered. "Commander, he is not alone." The words sent a fresh wave of unease through the room. Folktale turned back to Bantu, eyes burning with suspicion. "What are you?" Bantu met his gaze. "I am the last of my kind, the last warrior of my people." His voice was quiet, yet it filled every corner of the room. "But I do not fight alone." A whispering sound filled the air. At first, it was barely noticeable, like the wind moving through empty halls. But then it grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language that no XLRE had ever heard before. It came from everywhere, and nowhere all at once. The guards looked around, their weapons shaking in their hands. "Commander," one of them stammered, "we have to." The walls pulsed, not physically, not in any way the eye could see, but the entire room felt as though it had taken a breath. The air became thicker, the temperature dropping so fast that the alien soldiers could see their breath. Then they saw them. Figures, shadowy shapes that flickered in and out of sight, moving like mist yet carrying the weight of something far more solid. The warriors of old. Their bodies were carved from history itself, their forms shifting between the present and the past. They carried weapons unlike anything that XLRE had seen, spears that crackled with unseen energy, shields that absorbed the very light around them. The young soldier who had spoken earlier took a step back, his voice barely a whisper. "They are real." Bantu finally stood. The chains around his wrists and ankles sizzled, cracks forming along the metal, as if something unseen was breaking them apart. The energy restraints flickered and died. The spirits moved closer, their presence pressing down on the air like a storm ready to break. Folktale's hand tightened around his plasma blade. He had fought countless enemies, but there was no battle strategy for this. His soldiers were vanishing, and now he was facing something that should not exist. "This is your doing," he spat, stepping toward Bantu. The warrior tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. "This is justice." As the words left his lips, the lights in the fortress burst, plunging the entire chamber into darkness. And then the screaming began. The spirits awaken. The fortress had become a tomb of whispers. The moment the lights shattered, darkness swallowed the walls, stretching through the corridors like an endless abyss. The only illumination came from the dim, flickering glow of alien technology struggling to function, but even that was fading. The XLR, once confident in their dominance, now stood frozen in the blackness, their glowing red eyes darting in every direction, their weapons trembling in their clawed hands. Commander Voktale's breathing was ragged, his reptilian nostrils flaring as he strained to see through the void. "Report," he barked, his voice echoing into the emptiness. "What is happening?" No answer came. He could hear his soldiers shifting, their movements sharp with fear, but their voices were gone. The usual clicking of their armored boots against the steel floors was muffled, swallowed by something unseen. It was as if the fortress itself was unraveling, its presence slipping into another plane of existence. Then came the first scream. It was brief, sharp, and filled with terror. A soldier just a few feet away from Voktale had been there 1 second, and was gone the next. His plasma rifle clattered onto the ground, the metallic impact echoing through the chamber. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of an attack. Just absence. Another scream. Then another. The sound of bodies vanishing into the void. The air carried something cold, something ancient, a force far beyond the Cellari's understanding. And in the center of it all stood Bantu. His silhouette was barely visible in the shifting shadows, but his presence radiated power. The chains that had once bound him now lay in shattered pieces at his feet. The glow of his deep, knowing eyes pierced through the dark like a flickering flame. Around him, the shadows twisted, forming into shapes, humanoid but ethereal, their outlines shifting like smoke caught in the wind. The spirits had awakened. They were warriors, guardians of an era long past, clad in battle armor woven from the very essence of the ancestors. Their bodies flickered between solid and spectral, their weapons humming with energy not of this world. They were the unseen, the forgotten, the avengers of a stolen past. And now, they had come for those who had taken what was not theirs. Voktale's claws clenched as he activated the energy blade on his wrist. A sharp hum filled the air, but even the burning plasma could not chase away the unnatural chill that wrapped around him. He was a warlord, a conqueror of countless worlds, and yet, for the first time in his existence, he felt powerless. What are you?" he demanded, stepping back from the shifting figures. Bantu finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "You thought you took only me," he said, his tone measured, almost sorrowful. "But you took everything." His words carried across the chamber, and as they did, the spirits advanced. They moved without sound, their feet never touching the floor, their eyes glowing like dying embers. The XLR soldiers opened fire, their plasma rounds slicing through the air, but the spirits did not flinch. The energy blasts passed through them, as if striking mist, leaving no mark, no wound. Then the spirits struck back. One by one, the alien warriors were lifted from the ground, their bodies twisting as unseen forces gripped them. They thrashed, claws scraping against the air, their voices rising in panicked shrieks. Then silence. Each was consumed by the darkness, their existence wiped away as if they had never been. Voktale's heart pounded against his chest as he watched his soldiers disappear. These were his finest warriors, his elite fighters, and they were being erased as if they were nothing more than dust in the wind. He turned back to Bantu, who was now walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. The spirits moved with him, surrounding him like a living force, their weapons raised, their silent forms filled with purpose. "You took what was sacred," Bantu said, his voice as steady as a storm on the horizon. "And now, The spirits of my ancestors demand balance. Voktal's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, to find a way out of this nightmare. But the fortress, the once unbreakable stronghold, was no longer under his control. The walls groaned, as if breathing, shifting under an unseen force. The very fabric of reality in this place was bending, warping under a power beyond anything that Cell-Airy had ever encountered. The spirits were not simply here to destroy. They were reclaiming. The fortress was theirs now. Voktal let out a roar of defiance and lunged, swinging his plasma blade at Bantu. If he could not fight these wraiths, then he would kill the man who had summoned them. But before the blade could connect, a spirit intercepted him. A translucent shield, made of something far stronger than any Cell-Airy metal, blocked the strike. Voktal staggered back as the spirit warrior stepped forward, its burning gaze locked onto him. Then, for the first time, one of the spirits spoke, a deep, resonant voice, ancient and filled with command. Your war ends here. And with that, the fortress trembled. A final pulse of energy rippled through the structure, and the last remaining Cell-Airy soldiers screamed as the shadows consumed them. The fortress began to dissolve, fading piece by piece, swallowed by an unseen force. Voktal fell to his knees, panting, staring at the space where his warriors had once stood. He was alone. The fortress, his empire, was vanishing, and in its place, the spirits stood, victorious. Bantu exhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a moment, as if feeling the weight of justice settle. Then he turned and walked forward, stepping past Voktal without a second glance. The spirits followed, their forms blending into the mist, their presence lingering like the last echoes of a forgotten song. The fortress continued to fade, swallowed by the unseen. And then, with one final whisper of wind, it was gone. The battle for freedom. The silence that followed was unnatural. The mighty Cell-Airy fortress, once filled with the sounds of marching soldiers, mechanical hums, and the cold efficiency of war, was now devoid of all life except for one. Commander Voktal. He knelt in the empty corridor, his clawed hands pressing against the floor as his mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The fortress was vanishing, piece by piece, dissolving into an unseen abyss, and his entire army was gone. Not killed, not defeated. Gone. He had witnessed battles where entire planets were reduced to rubble, where empires fell in the blink of an eye, but never had he seen warriors simply cease to exist. The air still carried the weight of something otherworldly, something ancient. It pressed against his skin like an unseen force, and no matter how much he tried to push it away, it remained, like a phantom whispering in his ear. And then, in the vast emptiness that remained, he heard footsteps. Slow, measured, powerful. Bantu walked through the dissolving fortress, his body moving with the effortless grace of a warrior who had already won the battle. His deep, unwavering eyes locked onto Voktal as he approached, each step echoing louder than it should in the fading structure. Around him, the spirits moved like mist, their presence shifting between the seen and the unseen. Voktal forced himself to his feet, his grip tightening on his plasma blade. His pride would not allow him to cower, not even in the face of this unnatural force. "What have you done?" he snarled, his voice trembling between rage and desperation. "Where did my soldiers go?" Bantu did not stop walking. He did not even acknowledge the question. The fortress trembled again, and Voktal's vision swam as if reality itself was folding inward. The once solid walls flickered, becoming less real with each second. The warlord felt his stomach lurch. He had always believed in the power of science, in weapons, in technology. But none of those things mattered here. Here, the laws of reality were being rewritten, and he was at the mercy of something far older, something that did not care for plasma weapons or warships. He raised his blade again, aiming it at Bantu's chest. "Tell me what you have done." Bantu finally stopped a few feet away. He tilted his head slightly. studying Folktale with the patience of someone looking at a child who had yet to understand the world. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of countless generations. "You stole me from my home," Bantu said, his tone steady. "And with me, you stole something greater." Folktale bared his teeth. "You are just a man." A whisper passed through the air, a ripple of energy that sent a chill down the commander's spine. The spirits shifted, their forms solidifying for a brief moment, revealing their faces, men and women of 1,000 lifetimes, warriors of different eras, their eyes burning with the same silent fury. "No," Bantu said simply, "I am never alone." The fortress let out a deep, groaning sound, as if the very foundation was collapsing into itself. The walls cracked, the metallic beams bending in ways they should not. The accelerator technology was breaking down, unable to withstand the presence of the spirits. And then the battle began. The accelerator soldiers had already vanished, but the fortress itself fought to survive. The automated defenses sprang to life. Turrets emerging from the walls, mechanical drones activating, targeting systems locking onto the only 2 living beings remaining. The machines did not feel fear. They did not question what was happening. They simply reacted, following their programming to eliminate any perceived threats. Folktale barely had time to react as the first turret fired. A plasma bolt shot toward Bantu's chest, but before it could land, one of the spirits stepped forward. With a flick of its translucent shield, the blast was absorbed and sent back, shattering the turret into molten fragments. The fortress did not care. It simply adapted. More weapons activated. Energy blasts rained down from the ceiling. Automated sentries swarmed from hidden compartments, and the walls themselves shifted, creating barriers meant to trap Bantu inside. The fortress had been built to withstand planetary sieges. Now, it turned its full force on one man. But Bantu was not alone. The spirits moved as one, blocking, countering, dismantling every piece of machinery the fortress threw at them. Spears of pure energy sliced through turrets, shields deflected plasma fire, and the very air around Bantu shimmered with unseen power. The accelerator fortress had been designed to fight physical threats. It had never been built to withstand the force of warriors who had already passed beyond the veil of death. Folktale stumbled backward, his mind reeling. This was not war. This was something else entirely. Then the fortress let out a final, shuddering groan. The defenses faltered. The weapons failed. The last remaining energy cores flickered. And then, as if accepting its fate, the fortress collapsed. Not in fire, not in destruction, but in silence. It simply faded, dissolving like sand carried away by the wind. Piece by piece, the walls vanished. The halls disappeared. The machines, the weapons, the towering structure that had stood as a symbol of Cell-Airy dominance, gone. Folktale fell to his knees, staring at the endless void where his stronghold had once stood. He had lost everything. His soldiers, his fortress, his power. And yet, he still remained. Bantu stood before him, the spirits now circling him like silent sentinels. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. Folktale knew, in that moment, that he had not been spared. No, he had been chosen. The warrior studied him, then spoke in a tone that held neither malice nor mercy. "You will carry this burden now." Folktale barely had time to process the words before a searing pain burned across his chest. He gasped, looking down as glowing symbols, ancient markings of power, etched themselves into his skin. It was not a wound. It was something far worse. A curse. The last warlord of the Cell-Airy let out a strangled gasp as the weight of unseen eyes bore down upon him. He could hear them, the whispers of the vanished, the voices of the lost. They would follow him now. Watch him. Haunt him. A reminder of what he had done. Bantu turned without another word, stepping away into the mist. The spirits followed, their presence fading one by one, until only their whispers remained. And then, just like the fortress. They were gone. Voktal collapsed, his body trembling, his soul forever marked. The last commander of the Accelerary was no longer a conqueror. He was the haunted, the vanishing fortress. The stars stretched endlessly above, cold and distant, as Commander Voktal knelt in the silence of a world that no longer existed. The mighty Accelerary fortress, once a beacon of conquest, a stronghold of domination, was gone. Not destroyed, not reduced to ruins, simply erased. The barren land where it had once stood bore no signs of its former presence, no debris, no scars of battle. It was as if it had never been built at all. Yet Voktal remained, the last survivor, the last witness. His clawed hand trembled as he pressed it against his chest, feeling the heat of the glowing symbols that had been burned into his skin. They pulsed beneath his flesh, shifting like living entities, whispering in a language he could not understand. The weight of their presence was suffocating. Every breath he took carried an unseen force, pressing down on him, watching him. The voices of the lost. At first, they were nothing but murmurs, faint and distant, like echoes from another world. But with every passing moment, they grew clearer. He could hear them, their words forming around him, circling him like a storm. The voices of his soldiers, his warriors, vanished into nothingness, now whispered in his ears. Where are we? What have you done? Why did you take him? You brought this upon us. Voktal squeezed his eyes shut, his mind reeling from the weight of their presence. These were not the cries of the fallen. They were not the voices of the dead. No, this was something far worse. The Accelerary had believed in war, in strength, in power, but never in spirits, never in forces that could not be fought with weapons. And yet now, the commander of the Accelerary carried the burden of those he had lost. A gust of wind swept across the empty land, carrying with it the final remnants of what had once stood here. The air itself shimmered, rippling like the surface of disturbed water. And then it was gone. The last trace of the fortress had been swallowed by the unseen force that had claimed it. Voktal struggled to his feet, his breath uneven, his limbs heavy. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to escape, to return to the Empire and warn them of what had happened. But what could he say? What could he explain? That he had stolen a warrior from a world his kind deemed primitive. That he had underestimated a power far older than his own. That he had not captured a man, but had instead provoked the wrath of the unseen. No one would believe him. He was a warlord. He had conquered planets. He had crushed resistance with the might of fleets and firepower. And yet here, in the presence of something beyond his comprehension, all of that power had meant nothing. A shudder ran down his spine as a realization gripped him. This was no battle. He had not been defeated. He had been judged, and the verdict had been rendered. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the last remnants of the fortress had been devoured by the void. A part of him wanted to run, to leave this cursed land behind, to return to the Empire and warn them before they made the same mistake. But as he took his first step, the symbols on his chest burned. His vision blurred. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping voices speaking in languages both ancient and unknown. He clutched his head, staggering, feeling the weight of countless souls pressing against him. And then, before him, the shadows twisted. At first, they were merely distortions in the air, ripples of darkness that carried no shape. But as he watched, frozen in place, they began to take form. Figures emerged, faint at first, then sharper, warriors. They stood in a line, watching him, their glowing eyes filled with something beyond vengeance, beyond rage. These were not just warriors of the past. These were guardians of the forgotten. Vantu had spoken of them, had warned of them. And now Voktal understood. This was not a battle. This was a reclaiming. The Accelerary had not only taken a man from his home, they had stolen a part of something sacred, something that did not belong to them. and the spirits had taken back what was theirs. Folktale exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move. The figures did not block his path, nor did they strike. They simply watched, judging, weighing his soul. And then, as he took another step, the whispers shifted. They no longer carried the voices of the lost. Instead, they spoke with the weight of command, issuing words that struck deep into his being. Go. The moment the word filled his mind, his body lurched forward, as if the unseen forces themselves had pushed him away. The world around him blurred, the air vibrating with an energy he could not name. And then, in an instant, he was somewhere else. The barren land was gone. The fortress was gone. The warriors, the whispers, the weight of the unseen, gone. He stood at the edge of a cold, unfamiliar wasteland, the dark sky above filled with distant stars. The symbols on his chest still burned, but the voices had faded. Yet, even as he breathed in the silence of this new place, he knew one thing with certainty. He had not escaped. He had been banished, marked by something eternal, cursed to carry the memory of what had been taken. And as he turned his gaze toward the endless void before him, a chilling realization settled deep within his bones. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The final survivor. Folktale's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood at the edge of a world he did not recognize. The land stretched before him, barren and lifeless, a far cry from the mighty fortress he had once commanded. There were no stars above him, only an endless void that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The ground beneath his feet felt solid, yet it held no warmth, no essence of life. He clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms as the weight of his situation pressed down on him. His fortress, his empire, was gone, erased from existence by something beyond his understanding. The spirits had taken back what was theirs, and in return, they had left him with a fate worse than death. He was alone. For the first time in his existence, there was no army to command, no subordinates to obey his orders. The voices of his soldiers had vanished, leaving behind only a hollow silence. And yet, even in the stillness, he knew he was not truly alone. The symbols carved into his chest burned, pulsing with a life of their own. They were not wounds. They did not bleed. But they carried a weight that settled deep into his very being. It was a mark, not of honor, but of punishment, a reminder that he had crossed a line that should never have been touched. The XLR had believed themselves invincible. They had conquered countless worlds, crushed entire civilizations beneath their war machines. They had taken what they wanted without question, without consequence. But this time, they had stolen something sacred. And now he was cursed to bear the memory of that mistake. He stumbled forward, his body still weak from the unseen forces that had banished him here. His mind screamed for answers, but none came. He had no idea where he was, no idea how to return, no idea if he even could return. But then, a whisper. Not the whispers of the vanished soldiers, not the chaotic voices that had once surrounded him in the fortress. This whisper was different. It was singular, focused. You will remember. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. It was neither male nor female, neither gentle nor harsh. It was simply there, pressing against his mind, refusing to be ignored. Folktale turned sharply, searching for the source. His instincts screamed at him to draw his weapon, but he had none. His plasma blade, his armor, all the tools of war he had once wielded. They were gone, stripped from him as if they had never existed. He was truly vulnerable. Another whisper, closer this time. You will remember. His breathing quickened. The land around him remained unchanged, yet the very air seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. He could feel it, watching him, waiting. Then the ground beneath his feet shifted. A sudden wave of dizziness overtook him, and before he could react, memories surged through his mind, but they were not his own. He saw flashes of a world unlike any he had ever known, a land bathed in golden light, where warriors stood tall, their skin adorned with markings that glowed like the symbols now burned into his own flesh. He saw Bantu, standing among them, his expression calm, his eyes filled with wisdom far beyond his years. He saw battles, not fought with machines, but with spirit. Warriors moved like the wind, their weapons singing with an energy that was neither metal nor fire. They did not conquer. They did not invade. They protected. Then, another image. The moment that Sel-Eri had taken Bantu. He saw himself, standing in his fortress, victorious. He saw his soldiers dragging the warrior forward, shackling him, believing they had captured nothing more than a powerful enemy. He saw the arrogance in his own expression, the cold certainty that they had won. And then the final vision. The fortress fading from existence. Not burned, not destroyed, simply claimed by something greater. The realization struck him like a blade to the chest. That Sel-Eri had never truly conquered Bantu. They had never controlled him. They had been guests in a war they never understood. And in their ignorance, they had paid the price. Folktale staggered backward, the weight of the memories pressing down on him. The whispers grew louder, the unseen presence surrounding him, filling the air with something ancient. You will remember. The meaning was clear now. This was not just punishment. This was a lesson. He was to carry the memory of what had happened. He was to bear the weight of his people's crimes. He was to become the last witness of a war that should have never begun. His eyes burned, not from pain, but from something deeper, something he had never felt before. Regret, not just for his own fate, but for the countless civilizations that Sel-Eri had destroyed without a second thought. The lives taken, the homes reduced to rubble, the arrogance of an empire that believed itself untouchable. They had always thought themselves above consequence. But now he understood. The universe had always been watching. And when the time came, it had taken back what was stolen. The whispers faded. The unseen presence withdrew. The weight of the symbols on his chest remained. But the lesson had been delivered. He looked up at the void above him, his hands shaking. For the first time in his existence, Folktale did not know what to do. The warlord of the Sel-Eri was no longer a conqueror, no longer a leader, no longer anything but a ghost of his former self. And as he stood there, alone in the endless silence, a single question echoed in his mind. What happens now? The return of the warrior. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the sky above painted in warm hues of gold and amber. As the sun set over the vast African plains, a gentle wind rustled through the acacia trees, carrying the whispers of a time long past. The village sat in peaceful silence, its people gathered around a central fire, their voices hushed in reverence. Then a ripple moved through the air, a tremor, small but undeniable. The village elder, an aged man with deep-set eyes that had seen generations come and go, felt it first. He sat upright, his weathered hands tightening around the wooden staff carved with the symbols of his ancestors. The warriors of the village, men and women adorned in traditional battle markings, felt it next. They exchanged glances, their instincts sharpened by the knowledge passed down through the bloodline of their people. Something had shifted, something was returning. And then, as if stepping through the very fabric of time itself, he appeared. Bantu. He stood at the edge of the village, his form bathed in the golden light of dusk, his body untouched by the scars of war, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. His garments bore the remnants of the journey he had taken, the markings of his ancestors still glowing faintly along his arms. The village held its breath. A child, too young to understand the gravity of the moment, took a hesitant step forward. "Is it you?" he asked in a soft, curious voice. Bantu did not speak at first. He looked around, his deep eyes scanning the familiar faces, the land that had birthed him. He could feel it, the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the rhythm of life that had never abandoned him. Then he spoke. "I have returned." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of something vast. The moment they left his lips, the village erupted into movement. Families rushed forward, elders whispered prayers of gratitude, warriors raised their weapons to the sky in salute. But the elder did not move. He simply watched, his knowing eyes locked onto Bantu's. "You have been to a place few return from," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Tell us, child of the ancestors, what did you see?" Bantu exhaled, his chest rising and falling with the weight of memories that would never fade. He stepped forward, approaching the elder, and knelt before him. A warrior showing respect to the wisdom of those who came before. "I saw the arrogance of those who believe themselves untouchable," he said. "I saw the cost of taking what does not belong to you, and I saw the power of those who guard the unseen." The elder nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "And the fortress?" Bantu met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "It is gone. The spirits reclaimed what was stolen. Those who took me paid the price." Silence followed his words, stretching across the gathered villagers. Some nodded in understanding. Others whispered amongst themselves. They had always known, always believed, that the unseen world was not to be challenged, that their ancestors still walked among them, watching, waiting. The elder placed a hand on Bantu's shoulder. "Then it is finished." But Bantu shook his head. "No." The elder raised an eyebrow. "No." Bantu stood. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the stars had begun to emerge in the sky. "One still remains." The whispers returned to him then, faint, distant, but there. The presence of the spirits lingered at the edge of his consciousness, watching, waiting. Folktale was still out there, the last survivor of the Sci-Fi fortress, the warlord who had stolen what he did not understand, the man now marked by the spirits. Bantu did not know what had become of him. He did not know if Folktale would seek redemption, or if he would let the weight of his mistakes crush him. But he knew this: the universe does not forget. Somewhere, across the stars, the warlord wandered alone, marked, haunted. He had been given a second chance, a chance to change, to understand. But what he did with that chance, that was a story yet to be written. Bantu turned back to the village, where his people awaited him. He stepped forward, returning home, but in the back of his mind, he knew that this was not the end. No, this was merely the closing of one chapter.